So, let's make a baby. We're going to talk about pregnancy. So there's a summary that I'll also post on this on Blackboard, but I would like you to kind of try to follow along with this and take as many notes as you can, and then you can review that summary later on. The baby and producing a baby kind of starts with the release of the egg from the ovary. So when we look at the ovary here, on the ovary, a female is born with all of the eggs or pre-eggs that they're ever going to have. And those pre-eggs are stored in primary follicles. And the primary follicles contain the primary oocytes. Once a month, as of puberty moving forward, these primary follicles, which are trapped in or have oocytes that are trapped in meiosis I, are going to be stimulated to start to migrate toward the surface of the ovary. And as they do this, they're going to continue going through the cycle of meiosis. Eventually, they're going to be suspended in meiosis II, and they'll be trapped in secondary follicles, and they'll be called secondary oocytes. From the secondary oocytes, in those secondary follicles, the secondary follicles are going to develop a blood supply. They're going to be known as vesicular follicles, and that oocyte inside of there is still going to be trapped in meiosis II. Eventually, you're going to see a surge of luteinizing hormone, and that's going to stimulate the release of the egg from the ovary. So you have your primary, and I'm going to actually type this out for you. So actually, I'm just going to go through the summary that I've already got typed up here to save us some time. So oogenesis, like I said, the egg production, it's stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone. And that's where you have that primary follicle that contains the primary oocyte. And that's going to be suspended in meiosis I. So the cells starts to divide a little bit, starts to go through the phases of meiosis I, and then stops, and it's frozen in a primary follicle. And then it'll be stimulated to start maturing again and migrate toward the surface of the ovary. So as it's migrating toward the surface of the ovary, it'll resume meiosis and continue on that cycle of meiosis, and then productively advance into a secondary follicle. Inside of the secondary follicle, you have a secondary oocyte that's suspended in meiosis II. Then that secondary follicle is going to be stimulated to migrate toward the surface of the ovary again, and it's going to mature into a vesicular follicle. The vesicular follicle is ready to ovulate. The egg that's in there, or the oocyte that's in there, is still suspended in meiosis II, so it hasn't completed meiosis yet. Then you're going to have an ovulation event happen. You have this luteinizing hormone, and luteinizing hormone is going to peak in levels, and it's called the luteinizing hormone, or LH surge. And when that LH surge happens, that stimulates the release of the egg from the ovary. So here you can now see ovulation happening. You have a surge in luteinizing hormone, and the egg pops out of the ovary. Now, what is left behind, and why we call it the luteinizing hormone, is the corpus luteum. And what the corpus luteum is going to do is it's going to tell the body, let's wait a minute, let's build up our uterine lining so that we can get pregnant. If you just released an egg, it's your body's goal to get that egg fertilized and to get you pregnant. So if you release that egg and the egg is now trying to get fertilized, you want to build the uterine lining and give that egg a safe place to embed. If we look at this, get rid of this. This drawing, and you'll have to bear with me, I'm a terrible artist, but you've got the ovary, and then you have the uterus, and the uterine tube, and the uterus. Got the cervix here, uterine tube, and then you have another ovary over here. The egg was released from this ovary here, and the egg is going to start to migrate down into the uterus. Meanwhile, what's left behind on the ovary is the empty follicle, which turns into corpus luteum. Now this corpus luteum is controlling the destiny of the egg that was just released. It's saying, wait, because we want this one to get fertilized and we want you to get pregnant. The corpus luteum is going to start producing a hormone called progesterone. And this uterine lining is going to start to thicken. Now let's say we didn't have progesterone. If we didn't have progesterone, the uterine lining would be very thin, and there would be nothing for this to attach to. So as the egg were to make its way down into the uterus, it would be very difficult for it to attach to anything, and it could just fall out of the uterus. But when we have progesterone, we start to build this endometrium layer. And every day we pack on more and more of this tissue. And it just creates a safe place for the egg to land. So when that egg, or if that egg gets fertilized, it can land in this safe, cushy, nutrient-rich bedding of the uterine lining, and it can attach and insert itself, implant into the uterus, and then it can go on to have a successful pregnancy. So that's what progesterone is doing in this situation. The egg was just released by the ovary. The empty pocket that the egg fell out of turns into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum produces the hormone progesterone. Progesterone tells your uterus to build its uterine lining to give this egg an opportunity to implant. So this is where we are here. So the corpus luteum produces progesterone, and that promotes the thickening of the uterine lining. So there's two things that can happen after the fact. One can either get pregnant or not get pregnant. Let's go through the not getting pregnant first because it's a lot faster. The egg never completes meiosis. Progesterone production eventually declines, and when progesterone production declines, there's nothing telling this uterine lining to stay in place anymore, so that uterine lining is eventually shed. The egg is going to pass out of the body, unfertilized and unimplanted, and you're going to have menses happen, or menstruation. And the cycle is going to repeat. You're going to have the post-menstrual phase until ovulation. You're going to have the ovulation event. Then you're going to have the premenstrual phase, which is the luteal phase, where the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. And then if no fertilization happens, you're going to have menses again. And that's a continuous cycle that's going to keep losing an egg every month. But let's say there is a pregnancy event. In order to get pregnant, sperm is going to have to travel up through the cervix, so from the vagina, and it could have been stored in the fornix of the vagina, but the sperm is going to have to travel all the way up, travel into the uterine tube or fallopian tube, and fertilize the egg in the first third of the fallopian tube. First third. If the sperm does not fertilize the egg in the first third, it'll be too late. So that fertilized egg will just fall out and it won't be able to implant into the uterus. Or, what's worse, is it'll implant really low, and then you could have all sorts of issues through the rest of the pregnancy. Those types of pregnancy-related issues are going to be a topic that you're going to talk about more in advanced A&P. But I'm just giving you a basic idea of what happens during pregnancy. Another thing that can happen is this thing can be fertilized and implant into the tube. It's known as a tubal pregnancy or an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy must be terminated. As the baby starts to develop in the uterine tube or in the fallopian tube, this fallopian tube doesn't stretch. So suddenly the tube will burst and the baby and potentially even the mother would be lost at that point. So if a tubal pregnancy is discovered, then it has to be terminated. 1 in 4 pregnancies are tubal pregnancies. That's an alarmingly high number. So 1 in 5 pregnancies miscarry, 1 in 4 are tubal pregnancies. So lots of pregnancies end up not lasting or not working out. So it's kind of some scary statistics out there. So the sperm has come up and fertilized the egg. Some people buy those at-home fertilization or ovulation kits, and then they wait until the day that they ovulate or until the exact moment in time that they ovulate, and then they have intercourse. Well, here's the deal. This is a day-long journey to get up here, or it can be a day-long journey. So sperm should already be in the vagina before the ovulation event occurs. A friend of mine kept trying to get pregnant. She kept timing the time that she ovulates and did like body temperature and the kits and everything. And I gave her some simple advice. Have intercourse before you ovulate so that there's already sperm stored in the vagina and lots of it. So have, intercourse numerous times. And eventually, that sperm that's already in there will fertilize the egg. Shortly after giving her that advice, she ended up pregnant. Now she's got a little daughter. So anyways, we've got fertilization has to happen here. Once the fertilization event happens, that ball of cells, that initial blastocyst that's formed, is going to start dividing and dividing and dividing, and it will implant. And it should implant up here in the uterus. Like I said, if it implants too low, that's when things can become dangerous. The placenta can actually grow over the cervix, which it has a very poorly rich blood supply, so there's not a lot of nutrients in there, and it can cause placenta previa, and that's when the placenta grows over the cervix. If this woman even coughs or sneezes or lifts something that's too heavy, that cervix may open itself enough to allow part of the placenta to slip out, and you could lose the baby for sure, potentially even the mother. So we want this to implant up high enough. So sperm went up, fertilized in the right spot. Now the egg started dividing, and it implanted. It's going to start pumping out the hormone HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. HCG is the hormone that's picked up on the at-home pregnancy test. Eventually, now that I've got that there, I'm just going to mention what HCG does. HCG tells the corpus luteum to continue progesterone production so that progesterone will maintain the uterine lining and keep the uterine lining in place. If we've had an implantation event, we need this uterine lining to stay in place. We don't want menses to happen. So that's what HCG's job is to tell the corpus luteum to continue progesterone production so that progesterone can maintain the uterine lining for the pregnancy. So now we have our uterus, and we have the uterine lining. Eventually, about halfway through the first trimester into the end of the first trimester, you will have the development of the placenta. So here you'll see the baby. Baby's happy. And you'll see the umbilical cord leading to the umbilicus of the baby. You'll have the placenta, and then you'll have the amniotic sac. The placenta is just a bunch of tissue, and it's an organ for the exchange of nutrients and waste between the mom and the baby. The amniotic sac is that clear sac that surrounds the baby. Everything inside of the amniotic sac should essentially be sterile, although recent evidence suggests that there's bacteria that's growing inside of here that plays a role in the development of the baby. But that's new and developing research that is coming out. But anyways, so we're going to have this placenta, which is just this small region here, and then the rest of this is amniotic sac, and then there's amniotic fluid inside of here. And the umbilical cord is going to deliver nutrients and remove wastes from the baby. So that's the cord that leads from the baby to the placenta. Once the placenta is formed, the placenta produces its own progesterone. And that progesterone that's produced by the placenta will maintain the uterine lining for the rest of the pregnancy. So as soon as that placenta is produced at 12 weeks of gestation, that's kind of when we get away from the miscarriage is a likelihood type scenario. So as soon as you hit 12 weeks, it's kind of the safe time to start telling people that you're pregnant. You usually have seen a heartbeat by then or heard a heartbeat at the 12-week appointment. And if there's a heartbeat and there's no bleeding or anything like that, this placenta is now controlling the pregnancy. So the baby is kind of growing all by itself inside of the mom and controlling its own destiny at that point. So the 12-week mark is kind of the mark you try to hit when you're pregnant. As the pregnancy progresses, eventually the baby is going to turn upside down and the baby is going to work its way down toward the birth canal. As the baby is getting toward the delivery, baby's head is going to push down on the cervix is going to dilate, and that sends a signal to the brain to release oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions, which pushes the baby's head further on the cervix, which further dilates and causes the release of oxytocin. So this positive feedback cycle will build and build and build until the baby is expelled through the vagina. And then following the delivery of the baby, you'll have the delivery of the placenta. So the placenta, this tissue, will detach and eventually get delivered as well. So if you look at this, you have the development of the placenta at that 12-week mark. The placenta produces its own progesterone. The placenta is different from the amniotic sac because this is just the exchange tissue between the mom and the baby, while the amniotic sac is just a sac that surrounds the baby. Labor is a positive feedback mechanism that's promoted by oxytocin. If you go and get labor induced, the drug is called Pitocin, which is basically oxytocin or synthetic oxytocin. And then breastfeeding, prolactin stimulates the breast development and milk production. Oxytocin stimulates milk letdown. We talked about ectopic pregnancy. Infertility, miscarriage is loss of the baby before 12 weeks of gestation. Stillbirth is after 12 weeks of gestation. So just some things to wrap up this lecture. Here is a picture of the ova after ovulation. So this is the egg that's actually been released from the ovary. Twins. So how do twins happen? Well, there's fraternal and identical twins. In identical twins, one sperm combines with one egg, and then as this zygote starts to divide and divide and divide, it randomly splits into two separate balls of cells. And those are genetically identical. They will go on to turn into two individuals that are genetically identical. Identical twins happen entirely by chance. There is no hereditary component to identical twins. Fraternal twins tend to run in families, so this does have a heredity component. You inherit the ability to release multiple eggs from the ovary. So, with fraternal twins, you have separate eggs that get fertilized by separate sperm and develop into two individuals. These are no similar than brother and sister, sister and sister, brother and brother. They're not genetically identical. They just happen to be developing at the exact same time. There have been documented cases of fraternal twins coming from different fathers. So one sperm from one dad goes up one uterine tube and fertilizes one egg. Another sperm from another dad goes up another uterine tube and fertilizes the other egg, and the two babies are born as half siblings. So birth is a 3-step process. So you have labor, where that amniotic sac breaks and the water starts pouring out. Some people wonder, well, isn't the baby suffocating? No, the baby's breathing through the amniotic, or this umbilical cord, sorry. And as long as the placenta is still attached, the baby is still getting adequate oxygen. If the placenta dissociates or pulls away, then you have some serious issues. Then the baby has to come out immediately. If you know that that placenta has ripped away from the uterine wall, then the baby will die. So you need to get the baby out as soon as possible. One issue about having this amniotic sac break, if a doctor is the one that's breaking the membrane, is there's an increased risk of infection. Because it's an artificial rupture of the membrane, bacteria tend to go in there because the fluid doesn't rush out in the pressurized way that it would have if it broke naturally. So increased risk of infection if the doctor breaks the membrane as opposed to having the amniotic sac break naturally. Once the water comes out, like I said, baby's just fine, can be in there for hours and hours and hours. As long as the placenta's still attached, the baby's okay. The baby's going to be pushed through the birth canal. Notice the face of the baby is pointing toward the rectum. Sounds disgusting, but it's great if the baby can get exposed to the fecal matter from the mom, because the baby will get a face full of that, and that'll do the initial colonization of the digestive tract of the baby. That promotes the health of the baby and the initial colonization with those probiotics, and that's beneficial. Then the baby descends through the vagina. Like I said, the uterus expels the placenta as the last thing that comes out. Birth control tricks the body into being pregnant. So it is a dose of progesterone, which causes the uterine lining to be maintained. Once the progesterone goes away, then you typically have menses. But because the progesterone is present, it prevents you from ovulating. It also causes the buildup of a mucus plug in the cervix. So normally during pregnancy, you form this mucus plug in the cervix here, and that mucus plug comes out before the water breaks or before this amniotic sac breaks. The mucus plug is like this thick wax-like substance, and it usually has like a blood vessel or blood supply to it. So you'll see little like stringy blood vessels inside of it. While you're on birth control, your body thinks you're pregnant. So you're going to develop that mucus plug so sperm can't enter into the cervix. It's going to stop you from ovulating so you won't release an egg. And it's going to maintain that uterine lining. You usually take 3 weeks on and 1 week off. So if you're on birth control pills, you have actual hormone for 3 weeks, and then you have placebo for 1 week. If you're on the NuvaRing, which is a ring that can be put in the vagina, you put the ring in for 3 weeks, and then you take it out for a week. During that placebo week, or the week that you don't have the ring inside, then you should be menstruating at that time. Eventually, over the course of some time, your menses will stop. The breasts play a major role in reproduction for feeding the baby. So the breasts lie over the pectoral muscles. Estrogens and progesterone control breast development as well as prolactin. The breast size is determined by the amount of fat around the glandular tissue. Size is not related to the ability to produce milk. So the alveolus of the mammary gland, so here you can see milk is being produced by these cells, the myoepithelial cells, surround those milk-secreting epithelial cells. As the baby puts force on the nipple, that's going to cause the ejection of the milk, and that's all stimulated by the hormone oxytocin. Advantages of breast milk: nutrients, the passive immunity from antibodies that are present in the colostrum in the milk. It's IgA antibody. and the emotional bonding between the mother and the child.